Okay, our next speaker is Jaan Past, who'll talk on persistent homology. Jaan, Eerik.
Right, so while Imogen has shown us that topology happens in the real world, I'll try to put some numerical values to some of the ideas we see in topology. All of you, I assume, kind of know what topology is. It's just a very abstract way of looking at spaces where we can have kind of twisting and stretching. We don't care about the metric on the space itself. So Solzhenitsyn has said that, this is too abstract. We won't be able to use any of this before, say, the 24th century. But if you go a bit more into topology, you see that there's an area called algebraic topology, which looks a bit more concrete. You can have these massive sequences of spaces where you have maps between them, and you have lots of structure. So based on this idea of structure, we try to make topology useful in the 21st century. Now, people are better at recognizing shapes than computers. It's a really hard question for a computer scientist to know what something is. So why would we want to use topology, something that can't tell the difference between a donut and a coffee cup, to help us here? Well, the main point is that people are only good if we're working in 3 or fewer dimensions. And some of the data we want to analyze can be huge. So this is a disease gene network. Each of the dots is a different disease, and each of the color codings is a type of disease. So blue is diseases that affect bones. Everything is different. And then the connections are made by looking at which genes are apparent in people who have these diseases. So first of all, there are about 25,000 genes in the human genome that code for proteins. So the space is going to be huge. Furthermore, the connections between genes and diseases aren't quite clear, so it's really noisy. And the tool to analyze these sorts of spaces is called persistent homology, which I'll try to explain. But we begin with a smaller sample. Instead of 25,000 genes, we have 7 red dots. So the red dots are our point cloud here, that's our data. And down here we have what we call a barcode. At this point, it just shows that we have 7 dots. We have 7 points, and they're disconnected. Now, what do we do with points in the space? The easiest thing, I don't think there's any 4th year mathematicians here, but in 3rd year in analysis, we have all kinds of theorems about balls. So we try to construct some balls around the points. Now, we see that for some radius, the balls intersect. That means that the points that have the corresponding balls must be kind of close. And to really make that idea apparent, we connect the points that have balls that intersect. And in persistent homology, this connection is really made by using vector groups. And the 0-dimensional points are the points, and the 1-dimensional points would be these links between the points. And in barcode, we see that instead of having 7 disconnected components, we're down to only 5, because there's a connection here, and there's a connection here as well. That's fine. We see that there's some sort of closeness between some of the points. But obviously just one radius is not going to be enough to tell us anything about this data cloud. So we construct bigger balls. We get more connections, but what's most interesting is that in that cluster right there, in the top right-hand side, we have 4 two-way connections that connect up to make a circle. And as Imogen said, circles or cycles can be quite important in the sense that you can't always contract them down. And that's really the idea in persistent homology as well, that we count the, basically we count holes. This is a 1-dimensional hole, it's the inside of a circle. Well, it's topology, so here it's the inside of a square, which is the same as a circle. And if you think about it, that makes sense in terms of so we have that two-dimensional hole, and we note it down in H1. So H1 just looks at the two-dimensional holes, the insides of circles. And if you look back at H0, that makes sense, because one-dimensional holes, if you take a line and you chop off a point, you just get disconnected components. So now our barcode is more interesting. We don't just count disconnected components, of which there are 3 at this point, but we also count holes in 2 dimensions and note them down in green. So here we just have 1 hole and 3 connected components. Of course, we will build bigger balls, and then we see that there's more connections in that small cluster up there. And if we had 2 balls intersecting, we made a line. So kind of obvious next step is that if we have 3 balls intersecting, we should make a triangle. And in that small cluster, the triangles actually fill out the hole we had. So that hole is gone. Our barcode is down to just 3 connecting components again. Right, now if we increase the radius a bit more, there's more two-way connections in the cluster. And what we actually get is 4 triangles. And these 4 triangles, if you think about it for a second, actually form a tetrahedron. And the tetrahedron is empty on the inside. So what we get is another higher dimensional hole. So the pattern continues. Each of these H barcodes counts the holes in higher dimensions. So here we have 2 disconnected components, and no circles, no insides of circles, but a 3-dimensional hole. And if we increase the radius of these balls further, it gets a bit more boring. Here we kind of have a hole here, but as you can see, it's barely there. Everything almost intersects. So it's just a short green barcode over there in H1. And if we further increase the radius, everything just gets connected. There's a bunch of triangles, and everything is filled out. We have no holes. Our only barcode is this H0 just running on to bigger and bigger radiuses, which just says that if you make big enough balls, everything's going to intersect and our data is connected. So right, this construction process was fun. It was not that much fun. Why is this good? Well, first of all, there are theorems that say that the barcode, a very simple representation, completely characterizes the homology of the point cloud that we started with. So it's the barcodes will only be the same for spaces that are homeomorphic. And it's great to have a readable description if we start off with, say, a 25,000 dimensional space. And to kind of understand that a bit more, the theory is built from on modules, so it's all in terms of graded modules, and I can't really go into that in depth here, but if you look at the references on the sheet, then those are quite good. Theorems are really nice, but the other point that I want to make is that traditional methods of statistics assume quite a lot. If we say something is a Gaussian, we kind of throw away the structure we have in the data set and just, assume that it can be described by a nice wavy shape. And here, persistent homology really tries to look into data a bit deeper. And this is just another example where all of the steps in the barcode construction are given at once. So the data points are always the same, you get some cycles, but an important point to make is that short barcodes mean that this feature is only present for a short radius of balls. So the idea is that they're less important, they're just spurious features that go away quite quickly. But the longer barcodes might be important features. So for example, here we see that there's 2 or 3 holes for quite a big range of radiuses, so we might find it useful to think of our data as having some sort of feature that disallows some values. But what I actually did for my project was to use this idea of persistent homology that I've kind of tried to describe on images. And the question I asked was really simple.
Mm-hmm.
Why are these two pictures different? I mean, both of them have been in loads of movies, but what can persistent homology tell us? Now, the first issue that you would get immediately is that I can't just take a picture and say, this is my point cloud. I need to come up with some sort of method of generating data from the picture. And what I did was to zoom in on the local behavior. So if I zoom in far enough, I just get single pixels. And what I did was to take 3 by 3 pixel patches. So even though it doesn't look like it, I tried, it looked really bad. Each of these patches just contains 9 pixels, a 3 by 3 square. And then I took each of these 3 by 3 squares to be a data point. So my data points were really 9 vectors, where each of the entries is a grayscale pixel value. So for example, we see that this 3 by 3 square is boring, it's just a gray square. That one over on the right hand side kind of has random values, so it's some sort of noisy thing. But if we look at this one, we see that there's a bigger number, so a darker square. Grayscale goes from 0 being white to 256 being black, surrounded by 2 lower values, which are lighter spots. So if you think about it, that means there's a dark line running in the middle with 2 lighter lines on the side. So that's an example of what a 3 by 3 patch might look like. Right, so how did the 2 pictures that I showed you compare? Well, this is what the 9 vectors look like. Since we can't visualize 9 dimensions too well, this is just a projection of data down to 2 dimensions, just onto a plane. And while this doesn't have any persistent homology in it right now, this just goes to show that we would expect the 2 pictures to be slightly different. Furthermore, we would expect there to be some sort of structure, because this cross shape looks pretty good. And this cross shape corresponds to the picture on this side that was the city, whereas that slightly more blobby thing was the picture of the face. And if we now carry out the whole persistent homology process on each of these small dots, I think there's about 150,000 data points per each picture, we see that indeed the corresponding barcodes do have differences. The picture of the city, the projection looked like it had nice structure, the barcode has nice structure, while the picture of the face has a bit more noise. And the interesting thing is that this really seems to have a strong feature of having 5 2-dimensional holes in it. So there's some sort of circle thing going on. And other researchers have actually connected this idea of having 5 holes up to this model that I'll try to explain in a bit more detail. This says that the pixel patches lie on 3 different circles. They're aligned such that there's an outer circle and 2 inner ones, and each of the inner ones intersects the outer one at 2 points, but the inner ones themselves don't intersect. If you think about it, I can't have drawn this in 2 dimensions, that wouldn't work. But in 3 dimensions, that situation is impossible, but remember, the data is in 9 dimensions, so that kind of thing can easily happen. And furthermore, the idea is that each of these circles corresponds to a certain type of pixel gradient. So we saw before that we could have a situation where there's a bright line, for example, running through 2 darker lines. This sort of gradient could appear at any angle. We could have another patch that has a line running kind of diagonally through it. But also we could have the other situation where we have a dark line running through lighter areas. These two situations give the inner circles. And the reason for that is that this line could be at any orientation. So it fills up the whole circle. It's 360 degrees. And the outer circle corresponds to patches where we just have half of the patch being one color and half the other. And that again could be at any orientation, so it gives us a whole circle. And this is great as well, but what's the use? The same people have applied this idea to make a compression scheme for pictures. So basically the same thing as WinZip on your computer, but just for pictures. And what they've seen is that it's about 20% more efficient than WinZip would be. So what it kind of does is it takes the picture, does the splitting up into patches thing, and projects it down to not quite the three-circle model we saw before, but something similar. And that gives us the compressed file. And yeah, it's about 20% smaller than the compressed file would be from just using WinZip. I mean, it's nice, but there are lots of other applications. For example, Vitaly Burlin has used the idea of persistent homology to analyze pictures as well, but in conjunction with the Google Edge detection algorithm. And there again, he saw that in this case, shape detection was made more efficient by combining these two methods. And hopefully, because he's working at Microsoft Research, soon enough that means we'll be getting pictures of kittens soon with no humans involved in finding them. And on more serious applications, there is a group, which is the last reference, I think? No, it's the first reference actually here, that did persistent homology on arteries in human brains. And they tried to use regular statistical methods, but they couldn't find much interesting structure in it. But using persistent homology, they saw that the branching ratio of the arteries, so how far they spread out, corresponds really well to the age of the brain that was being scanned, well, the age of the person being scanned. And this means it could be used to analyze brain scans and see if a person has a brain age that's older than the real age, which could be a sign of some sort of neurodegenerative disease. But again, persistent homology, like I started at the beginning, can be applied to any sort of point cloud. So there's applications in robotics, in detector networks, for example, if you have security cameras, the possible motions through that network of security cameras is an interesting space as well. And there have been all kinds of results. And for that, really, Carlson's survey paper probably provides the best overview. And that's all by me. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Exactly. Yeah.
The 5 hills that you get from in the barcode for the picture of the city, do they ever fill in at any point, or do they just always stay there?
So, if you look at this this barcode, it looks like they go on forever.
Yeah. But
Obviously, there is a cutoff radius here. In any sort of point cloud, if you just took the radius to infinity, everything would be one massive blob. So whenever I did the analysis here, I would take a cutoff radius that would somehow correspond, would be based on kind of the mean radius inside, mean distance between data points in my point cloud. Yeah.
So when you analysed the picture, you used a 3x3 grid.
Yep.
How would things have changed had you used a different grid size?
So 3x3 grids were the grid that was originally used. And the reason is actually quite simple. If you have a 4x4 grid, you would get a 16-dimensional vector. So this picture would start looking a lot messier. And there is actually a researcher in China who has done it through, I think, up to 9x9 grids. But the issue is noise. It's harder to find structures in higher dimensional data, basically. But it can be done. And that's actually a good point. There's hopes that this same idea could be used on moving pictures, so movies, where you would take, say, 3 consecutive frames and try to analyze the sort of movement that happens in there. And I actually tried to do that as well, but I did write the image analysis program, but the one for movies wasn't quite there yet. I couldn't find much structure because my code was a bit too inefficient. Another point to make is that you actually need to do a bit of pre-processing on your data, because otherwise, kind of again, this whole thing would just be filled up. And here, this really represents the more dense part of the data. So, kind of remove the outliers. And there's different statistical approaches to that as well.
Any more questions? Okay. No. Thank you.